I had removed him from the comments. This is our former board chair.
Hey Janice, how are you doing?
Man, I wish you had stayed. That's all I can say. Teresa, I love you. But I wish you had never left.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm sure you would have grown sick and tired of me.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think so.
All right. It's a distance, and I never got a chance to say hi.
Yep. Try not to filibuster. I will say,
Before I said that to you, Chris.
There is, if you prefer to just hold it, there's enough cable like so it's whatever you guys want, kind of lean into it or just hold it.
Your triple vaccine is also not. You're not going to be doing that mask since your triple vaccine.
no, I know I can't mask it. Yeah,
Just for us.
I don't care.
Good morning, everyone. Hello. I walked into this room this morning with all the empty chairs, and it lifted my heart just thinking that soon there would be people in there and that we would be here together. Wonderful to be together on this occasion. I know you were sitting there extremely disappointed because I am not Ned Racine. I hope that Ned will be with us soon and that all is well. So let's all just take a breath and send it to Ned. And wherever he is, that he is well. And you know that he has great stories and history of our congregation that not only would he share this morning, but he will continue to share with us throughout time. So we look forward to many opportunities to do that. And the joy of being able to have a conversation today with Lee and Teresa about ministry, about history, governance, and change at neighborhood. So that's what we're here for today. And in addition to that, you see that we're connecting, as Frank said in early service, if you happen to be there, to the ongoing interim process. And so we want you to be continuing to be thinking about the questions that are important for us to explore, as we have been doing virtually and now are able to do in some ways together in person. We are also Zoom streaming this, so we have a whole crowd of people there on Zoom. Hello to the crowd on Zoom. And we are recording this so that, because we have requests from some people who were not able to be here. So I forgot to check with you on that. So I get ahead of okay. So the note cards on your chairs are for you to be able to share reflections on milestones in neighborhood's history that are important to you. And those will be compiled into a growing timeline over the time of our period of the next year. And then what questions about our neighborhood history might we explore together through the interim time? But for today, we are going to, should I go somewhere else? Okay, cool. Huge thanks to Eric for realizing that having sound this morning would make this event more accessible and give us the opportunity for people who prefer to be outside to be able to hear us. So thank you for figuring that out. And as always, setting it. So for our discussion today, we'll start with Wade. Great to have you here.
Thank you.
We'll be together. And as we think back to your time with us here, just sharing any reflections on what you saw as the strengths of the congregation at that time, and what you saw as change during that period in this church's history, which was 1994 to 2003, if that's right.
I think I remember that.
I remember the 2003 because that's when Kenzie was born.
Is this, do I use
It
this?
is live, yep. And if you hold it close, then people can hear you well.
All right. Well, I hope Ned's okay. The only, good thing about him not being here is, avoiding the contradictions that he was certain to. But then there's the rest of you too, so, you're problematic in that regard as well. I believe that the question was, and Elizabeth, I'm sorry, I'm going to forget the question.
Strengths.
Tell us whatever you want to tell us.
All right. Well, I think that was what strengths were here. And I think I need to think about it. It was just a time of great change. Some of which was met easily and some of which was not met easily. But almost all of the change had to do with a few things. First of all, the congregation at the time had kind of accepted the vision that Brandy Lovely had put before the congregation in the past few years of his ministry. And that vision was for the church to become a beacon church, a church that was considered the flagship Unitarian Universalist church in California, really on the West Coast. And when I arrived, I was like kind of getting on an elephant and, trying to ride that elephant, the elephant being the congregation, of course. And it was just right, there was a huge amount of growth in the membership. And that created not only a lot of change and was a change, but that in tandem with the other big change that the congregation was intent on doing, I think was also the other feature during those years. And that was that the church wanted to be more outwardly directed and was eager to do that. So the changes that were really inherent in those years had to do with those two things. And that created something, I think it's important to say, a change in the church's identity, which is hard. It's always hard. A strength of the congregation is moving through that change in identity and being able to work it through and being able to really figure out how to contend with the problems that we didn't know were on the horizon until they actually were, right in front of us. Was that the question?
So we had the pleasure of having dinner together on Friday night, and Lee was telling me some, exactly this dynamic of how can you ride that elephant of change. And one of the things that you said was that it wasn't like you set out to grow. It wasn't like you set this goal and there were going to be this great growth, but you had to respond to the growth by making the changes that you had to make. So do you want to say something more about the structural changes that growth necessitated?
Well, sure. I remember, because it happened pretty quickly, that growth, and at least it seemed like it did. And within a year, we had really gone from a church which was 450 to over 600, and we were constantly trying to keep up. I remember one of the things that I did was to go down to San Diego, which is a large church at the time, and to just shadow the ministers there, to kind of figure out, well, how do they do this church, and what do you, and what are you, what are you really, how do you function as a minister in this size congregation? I'd never done it before, and the congregation had never done it before too. And I came back with a lot of different ideas. But there were two real lessons in that. The first one was personal. And the lesson I learned was that, oh my God, these people were working really, really hard. And I knew that meant that I was probably going to have to do that too if we were going to maintain this. I mean, and the other thing was that it changed the relationship between the staff, the board, and the larger congregation. It didn't change the basic hallmarks of being a democratic volunteer organization. That was still important, but it got carried out differently in that size, based on the needs of expectations. One of the things that was that anything I need to know? I thought it was coming out of there, or somebody's water bottle or something. Anyway, I think that was. If you want to go into that deeper, we can. I think, if I can remember.
Well, yeah, and since we are considering governance changes that James is going to help lead us through, one of the things that I know from my experience is that we end up doing governance backwards, right? We don't decide, okay, we're going to make this big change so that we can accommodate this growth. We actually end up having to make changes in order to deal with what is in front of us. And I think it's hard for a congregation to understand that, because what you're experiencing is, oh, everything's changing. When in fact, what we experience as ministers is, yes, everything is changing. And so there it is. Hey, come on up. You can sit here. Right here. So I think there's that dynamic of, we are the ones that see this whole system. And therefore we recognize that this and this and this needs to change. Whereas what you see is your part in this committee and your part in this particular kind of thing. And so there's always that juggling dynamic that happens when we make governance changes. So do you want to say a little bit more about how that worked?
Yeah, I just want to say, checked in with Ned. They're doing okay. Mm-hmm. Okay, good. So yeah, I mean, we just were doing church, and my own personal thought is that anytime you mess around with the bylaws, you're asking for trouble. That doesn't mean it doesn't need to happen, but it just means that, you know what? It's like everybody's going to look under the hood, and everybody's a mechanic, and everybody has a different opinion about how to fix the car. What we were doing, I think, when we adopted the bylaws that we did adopt at the time, was to catch up to what we were doing, in order to function as a large church. And the idea was not, I want to just say, the idea never was, how do we function as a large church? The idea was, how do we have a religious community that meets the needs of the people who are there and that meets the needs of the world, which are outside there. So it was all about, service, really, all about service. And that infrastructure called the bylaws was the guiding kind of document by which we carried out that much bigger mission. The challenge of bylaw revisions is always that it's really easy to lose sight of the big picture and get caught into, well, what are we, who did we used to be, how did we used to function, should we go back to that, do we really want to do this? These are all legitimate questions, but they're legitimate, I think, and they're best addressed in a context that's not called bylaw revisions. So that's my own take on that. Were you asking something else, Teresa?
No, I'm going to pause and let Ned ask a question because you came in right in the middle, so you probably have no idea what we're talking about. So,
as most Sundays. Well, one of the questions I wanted to ask is your last pastoral assignment was here before you went to Walmart. So looking back at your time at Neighborhood Church, what do you take away now when you look back at those years?
Well, yeah, I'm in a retrospective mind. And so I actually think about this quite often, but I had one, I was really a fortunate minister. There aren't many that can say what I'm about to say. I had 3 fabulous church settlements where we were really able to do effective work together. That was really fun. And of those 3, I have to say that Neighborhood was the one that, held my passion. I mean, the church is still in my will and Chris's will. We have a joint will. Just to catch you up on all of our legal proceedings. And the reason for that was that I am a person that I know is unlike 99% of the world. And that is like, I actually like change, and I'm going to say something that I would never have said if I were actually getting paid by the church. I believe in change for change's sake. I know that how many times do you hear, but I really believe you're either changing or you're not. And changing is so important, and I am energized by change. And I think that as I look at the scope of my own vocational service over the years, I think that maybe the biggest mistake I ever made, consistently at least, I made some big ones, but consistently made, was forgetting that not everybody is energized by change. And that was a lesson I took from here that I took to the seminary, which really held me in good stead as we went through even more changes than Neighborhood ever, could conceive of. So, but one of the reasons I thought is because I'm a Unitarian Universalist minister who believes that the job of the church is to make the biggest impact on people's lives as possible. To me, the question is, should we grow? We didn't ask that question back then because you know what? You meet people's needs. That's what it is. And this church was intent on doing that. It was intent on receiving that, 150, 200 people who were all of a sudden at our doorstep. And many of whom I see in the room, I think, today. And, we were just really intent on making sure that people got served. And this church had a high bar of expectation, which I think was really also important, not just to attracting people, but to making sure that we were carrying out our mission in the best possible way.
I want to ask both of you this question. What concerns you most about the denomination for the next 5 years?
Go ahead, Teresa. Let me try to get my answer figured out by the many, many responses.
Well, it's kind of what I wanted to get into too, because I think that Lee and I have shared in our denominational service, the question about how do our congregations need to change, how does our denomination need to change to meet the changing needs of the world. And it's so easy for a congregation locked into your own perspective to miss that larger perspective. And so, you know, we were talking about this as well. There's this doom and gloom, congregations are dying, all of that, I remember talking to Kay Montgomery about this, who was the executive vice president for eons. And she said, you know, Teresa, when you talk about the church dying, we've been saying the church is dying for 40 years and it hasn't died yet. So that was a really helpful comment for me to hear. Like, you know, we can do that kind of doom and gloom, but I think we are at this pivotal moment right now with COVID and also with what people's needs are going to be in the which, who knows what people's needs are going to be. And so I do see congregations really struggling. You have the advantage of having a substantial size. I know it's not the size that it was when you were here, but that in and of itself is a strength that can carry it forward. 75% of our congregations are under 100 people. And so whether they have the strength to go forward is a whole nother question. But I do think that if we can take what we've learned from COVID and start to blur the boundaries between congregations and what I always used to say, lowering the walls, then we have the potential to meet people's needs in a way that may not look exactly like we did before, but it still has the potential to hold the space in the world that I think Unitarian Universalism needs to hold and that it serves. So it depends, Ned, on how we actually pivot at this point.
But I didn't hear your concern. I heard your optimism. What's your concern?
I think we are negotiating a massive culture change right now, which you have experienced as well in terms of really reckoning with our white supremacy structures, and how we navigate that, I think, is one of the biggest challenges we have ever faced. And so finding a way to have some integrity in how we do that work and to not feel like, oh, I have to bring absolutely everybody along because we're never going to have everybody come along. But to do it in a way that also doesn't say, screw you if you don't believe in what we're talking about. So that's, I think, my biggest concern is how we balance that.
And you, Doctor?
Well, one is external and one's internal. So externally, my biggest concern is just the fact that, you know, religion, organized religion across all denominations and all faith traditions is losing its appeal to people. And, you know, that's a cultural thing over which we have absolutely no control. But we have to recognize, as we think about how we want our churches to function, that we're going against the tide. And that calls for innovation, that calls for boldness, and that calls for a real steadiness in moving forward. The other one is internal, and I'm going to agree with Teresa. My biggest concern is churches struggling with, you know, white supremacy culture and how they implement their need to dismantle that, and how they distinguish what part of this institution is white supremacy culture, what is not. You know, how do you distinguish between them? How do you, I think Teresa used the word navigate, how do you navigate that in a way that, and Teresa said, you know, she's concerned about whether or not we'll be able to attract people if we don't somehow do this in a way that is truly authentic. I'm concerned also about the many, many persons of color that have been attracted over these last many years to our denomination and to our churches, about whether or not they will stay with us. In 1969, when when the denomination had the big internal fight about the Black Power movement, that's a whole history that's quite, it can be quite detailed. But the result of that was losing the confidence of the persons of color who were in the denomination at the time. And you saw a big exodus. And it just, it brings tears to my eyes now, just thinking about that. And the potential for that happening again, we have to figure out a way to avoid that.
So I'm going to shift that in the direction of ministry, because obviously you were in the position of noticing changes in ministry, and you really implemented all kinds of wonderful innovations in how you did ministerial training by recognizing that, again, the walls had to come down. People had to be able to be in their situations and learn from, the parishes that they were serving, as opposed to sitting in a seminary and in a classroom all the time. So at the same time, there are lowering numbers of ministers, and there are ministers who really want to do community service. And so what do you see that's important for us to know as we enter into a search process?
Well, so that's a big one. Let me just gather my thinking about the order in which the best way to say this. So yeah, ministry is changing, and the expectations of people going into the ministry are changing. I don't know that there are fewer ministers. There are, however, fewer people who are interested going into parish service. And there's a reason for that. Most of these people have been in the kitchen of the restaurant, and they're not sure they want to eat there. They've sat through board meetings. They've watched church fights. They have watched the way that some congregations have treated ministers, and they're not eager in general to put themselves into that situation. Now, I will say that that there are still plenty of excellent people going into the ministry and serving as ministers. That doesn't mean that what I find really amazing, at least in our program at People, is that there were many people who, when they arrived, were intent not to do parish service. By the time they left, they were on the parish track for sure. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One was this fabulous education.
And the leadership of
Well,
that
leadership.
institution. Yeah.
That goes on. But it's also that they got a chance to see it work in healthy situations first, and make sure that people were able to have a good experience of ministry, a good witness of ministry and church. And that would turn the tide like that. And there's also something else in that for Unitarian Universalism, the parishes are the seat of who we are. This is where the action is in Unitarian Universalism. This is where the action is. So,
I have another question.
Mike, please.
Oh, Mike, please. So is that mumbling rumor true? Is that true? Well, I'll ask both of you this question also. What would you like the congregations to do in the next 5 years?
You're going to make me go first.
I'll go first. I got nothing to lose.
Go ahead.
Well, I have no description for congregations. I want to say this. I think we don't know what's going to happen coming. I think that we can't be guaranteed that everyone's going to come back after not being in church for a year and a half. I think that it's not just enough to open the door to get people reconnected to the church. I will say, I'm going to tell you my own experience. At the beginning of COVID, I saw some fabulous services online. After a few weeks, I never turned it on again unless I was preaching. It just, and yet I'm totally out of the habit of going to church as a Christian. Totally out of the habit. And habit is part of what, keeps us together is habit. So I think that what I wish for the churches would really have their antenna up about this and to realize it's not just enough to be there. It never was, incidentally, but especially now, to just be there, that you actually have to start thinking, what can we do that we haven't thought of before that's going to generate the kind of interest that will get people here and reconnect them to the feeling of community, of service, and faith that brought them here in the first place. That's my answer. What's yours?
Well, as we like to say, interim ministers are pre-fired, so what do I have to lose? I think the hardest thing, and I say this to myself as much as I say this to you, I think we are necessarily forced by COVID into a kind of narcissistic loop, where what we mostly consider is ourselves and our own safety and our own activities. And as we've gotten out of the habit of being in the give and take of community, that's only gotten more so. And I understand that. I understand that completely. I have to really make myself get out and do things now. And once I'm now in the habit of it, I just can't tell you how much I love it. But I think that we are, and I said this sort of in a sermon recently, we're going to have to force ourselves to move past our own narcissism. We're going to have to force ourselves to think about, what can I give? What can I do for others? What can I volunteer for? All of those things that I think it's been really easy to kind of shrink back away from. And that doesn't mean you have to do all the same things you did before. You may want to try some new things and try to experiment in different kinds of ways. But I think really pushing ourselves to get out of this, what do I want to get? And instead, what can I give? And how can I help move this congregation in some new and vibrant sort of ways? So that's the end of my lecture.
Quick one. Until you mentioned it, I didn't realize I was up here with two people who really have difficulty keeping a job.
So I have one more question for you, Lee. I know that one of the things that we've been talking about in relationship to governance and looking at past ministries is this question of balancing administration and ministry. Now, I know you're teaching a class on administration right now, so this is particularly helpful from you. I think that's a false construct to some degree. I don't think that there's a distinction in any large degree, but I know that I didn't go into ministry so that I could, read spreadsheets. So I'm really grateful that Elizabeth Campo is here reading spreadsheets for us. And so I think we're still, and at the same time, I think ministers don't often want to let go of control in the way that sharing administration often requires. So do you want to talk about what you see happening in those?
Sure. I mean, so just a couple of things. One is that it used to be, I don't know if it's this way anymore because I've been out of this loop for a long time, but it used to be when a minister, a potential minister filled out, when a congregation was seeking a minister, they had to rank order the kinds of offices of the ministry that they thought were important for this their prospective candidates to have. And it was like, preaching, religious education, justice, and then there were 17 of these things, and the last one always in every single congregation was administration. And what I could recognize is that administration was also the thing that was getting my colleagues into trouble with their congregations. So I titled the course, Tools to Overcome Your First Obstacles. I mean, so, and congregations, first of all, there's not a common understanding among us. And I don't mean among ministers or among congregations, but among everybody about what administration is and what is the appropriate level of administration for a minister to have in a congregational context. In administration, from a minister's point of view, is everything from board relations to fundraising, to technology and overseeing technology. It doesn't mean doing it. It means having enough.
Listening to, let me leave. The
I don't even know what that is.
Someone I turned off their mic.
I mean, who's talking to me that thing? Just curious, I don't hear well. So, where was I? So about administration. So it's really important whether, and I've seen congregations that have sort of split out the two functions, but there's still someone that oversees the administrative function, and it is always the senior minister. And the thing about ministry is this: none of us can do everything well, but all of us should be expected to be able to make sure that the things that we don't do well necessarily are done well. So, you know, when I would interview, for instance, for, you know, prospective people to the school, I wanted to get a sense about this kind of thing from them. We would never, ever just say, tell us what you would do if. We'd say, show us that you've done this, and now enter into this exercise with us so that we can actually see how they function in these regards. Everybody will tell you they can do this. And a lot of people can. Teresa mentioned that I'm teaching a course on administration, which I've done many times over the years. I have 15 students in that course right now. And I would say that about 8 of them have incredible administrative backgrounds and really understand the level of administration that a minister in a congregation has to have in order to, and how much they don't have to have, and in fact shouldn't have. Yeah, I'm not going to read the spreadsheets, but I'm going to make sure that, you know, in my case, Deborah Peepers, they're reading those spreadsheets. Boy, did she get mad at me sometimes. I did not like the information she was giving me. So, is that helpful?
Yep.
You know, one thing that's struck me, yes, that's flaccid, that's not me. One thing that strikes me in all the history I've read of this church is how many things have to work for this place to be here. I mean, the lights have to run, the mortgage has to be paid, property tax has to be paid. Do the new ministers, the ministers you see, realize that, how many nuts and bolts things have to happen for a ministry to continue?
Well, they do and they don't. I mean, nobody really knows what they're getting into in any job, right? I mean, you never really know until you get there and you realize you turned on the light switch and the bulb was burned out and you didn't have a mechanism for figuring out how to do it. I think that, but I think that people learn really quickly that this is one of the things that they need. And, you know, so here's the situation. You know, ministry is also not just a matter of having a bunch of skills. It's also a matter of having the kind of self-awareness that allowed you to grow. So, for instance, people would say to me, Ned, how do you tell who's going to be a good student at school? And I said, I have no idea how to tell that before they arrive. I said, I need at least a year with a student to know whether or not they're going to be a decent minister. Because what I'm going to be looking for are character. It's a character. And I don't mean ethical. I mean, do they have the kind of self-awareness where they try to improve where they where they might be somewhat deficient? Do they have, can they take criticism? I mean, a student who gets mad at me because they got an A- instead of an A, we're going to have problems down the line, you know, if that's how thin their skin is. And they have to, show a vulnerability. So along with the skill, I mean, the skills are important, but it doesn't tell the whole story.
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. I often say that I learned a long time ago not to hire people because they have skills. I hire people because they have the kind of character that can take things on. When we had Ginger as membership coordinator and all of a sudden we needed a communications person, she was like, I don't know how to do communications. Are you kidding me? And she learned because that's the kind of person she is. She was able to take on those different things in a way that was actually kind of counter to her own experience of herself. So I think that that's what I look for. And I look at, again, that sense that you're just talking about your ability to grow, as opposed to, I think I have all the answers. And I was just talking to a colleague who has a staff person that's driving me crazy because they can never admit that they made a mistake. And so I think that's, again, something to really look for. And I remember seeing students coming through Harvard, and the first time I met them, I would be like, oh my God, what's going to happen with this? And then all of a sudden, after a year, 2, 3, they turn into people that can be good ministers. And so it's just been a perpetual learning for me that this is not about what you have in your head. It's about where your heart is and how you can grow into bringing the things into your head that you need. And I think that's why we talk about seminary education as formation. It's not education so much as it is formation. And so I think that looking for ministers that bring those kinds of qualities is, I think, the most important part of what you need to find.
I would like to read this at some point, but I will have one more question for you. So if you could go back, what one thing would you do differently about your ministry? Over the whole. Oh, yeah.
This is awful. Nothing. Let me be a little bit more reflective. What would I do differently? Well, I think I would go back and I would realize that change was not as easy for everyone as it was for me. And I would anticipate that. I also teach conflict. And they happen in churches. I don't know if you know that.
All churches? They really happen in all churches?
They are human institutions, my friends. They're human institutions. But so one of the things that we talk about is how to put into place the mechanisms that, don't I don't use the word manage conflict because I don't, but use conflict as a creative process to be able to move into the future. And what that means is what I heard today, all these listening sessions and everything that are happening, right? And I thought, that's just so great. That's just so great to regularly have those kinds of sessions with people who don't feel, and led by people who don't feel like they have to give the answers, but who are taking in the information, and especially the leaders taking in the information, not so that they're going and I want to go back to one thing that I think really changed in when I was here that I think is really important for this conversation. And that one of the things that changed was in the board itself. It was the dynamic, which went from at the time when I arrived, it was like what, 20 people or something. Anybody remember 20 people?
Yeah.
I couldn't count that high. I remember that. And one of the things we found was that the decisions were all being made in the executive team because they were too big for the entire board to handle. So, because what would happen is the executive team would come in, they would say, well, here's what we discussed, and bam, they would get, basically rubber stamped, and we realized that, really the only way to get really fully engaged board was to decrease the influence of the executive team and to increase the conversation among the board. And one of the things that occurred is that we went from being a board where, everything was, kind of approved or unanimously approved, to being one where it was okay to disagree, to vote opposite of your board mate. But then when the board then made a decision, it was a board decision. And people did not, second guess them. They didn't drag it back out to the congregation. They didn't do all that. That was just a gift that, this church has always had just amazing lay leadership. I mean, just amazing lay leadership. And the people that have served on these continuously on the boards that I work with and committees, I just can't speak highly enough of the level of leadership that this congregation had, at least in the years that I was here, and I'm sure it's even better now.
I won't say that in front of those of you who were board chairs 25 years ago, but certainly it has continued, absolutely. I mean, I think it's sort of what I was just talking about. I think the biggest lesson I had to learn in ministry was that it wasn't about what I know. It's about how much I could listen. And I tell this story all the time when I was head of congregational life at the U of A and trying to change the district structure, which, was the most Byzantine and ridiculously structured thing you could imagine, which you could look at it online and on paper and go, oh my God, whoever created this? And the answer was nobody ever did. It was just this piecemeal thing. But changing it was like taking babies away from mothers. And they were so invested in those structures. And at one point I went into a district board meeting full of all my arguments about why they needed to change what they needed to change. And instead, my boss at the time, Harlan Limbert, was like, Teresa, shut up. And the first thing we had to do was listen. We had to listen to what they were concerned about, to what they were trying to do, to what their goals were. And we listened to them into the same answers. And they actually came up with some improvements that I wouldn't have made. So that was a huge learning for me. And I remember Ian Evison, one of my colleagues, saying, you weren't like that when you were the minister in Chicago. And I think that was totally true, that learning that ability to listen is, I think, the most important thing that I had to learn.
Well, thank you. Out of questions.
Okay, great. Any last words, Lee, that you want this congregation to?
Yeah, but I'm gonna say in church service.
Okay. All right. All right, well, we're gonna give Lee a little bit of break before the second service, but thank y'all. It's so great to see you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, all right, thank you. Give them to Elizabeth.
Thank you for these beautiful buildings, Liz.
Ah.
Hey, you guys did that, not me.
Yeah, you understand.
It's a wonderful to be in it. It's still standing.
Aging pretty well.
What'd you say?
It's aging pretty well.
It seems like it, yeah. We're right about at the time where looking starting to lose their, right? So we're around 25 years, you're really starting to pay attention. Oh, yeah.
Probably takes you a while to get out of the house with me and wheelchairs. Probably takes you a while to get out of the house with me and the